Hello, and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we'll travel back in time to the 33rd Academy Awards, which awarded the films of 1960. Richard Brooks arrived with a provocative look at evangelism in small-town America in the form of Elmer Gantry, based on the Sinclair Lewis novel of the same name. The film starred Burt Lancaster and went on to earn 5 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, taking home 3 prizes. But it was the comedy drama The Apartment that walked away with Best Picture in the end. So why did Elmer Gantry come up short? We'll explore all this and more as we discuss how the Oscar almost went to Elmer Gantry. Welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I am your host, Kevin Jacobson, and today we are wrapping up the 1960s with our look at the year 1960. And today I have a new guest joining me who has been wanting to be on the show for a while, and I'm so excited to have him on now. He is the founder and managing editor of Thin Gold Line, his new awards-friendly website, and is also a writer for Bustle. Please welcome to the show, Jefferson Grubbs.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited to have you help me kind of ring in the rest of 1960s here. So
it's gonna be fun.
Yes, it's the end/beginning of an era as we're going backwards. And today we are talking about Elmer Gantry, which is the film that I've chosen as the runner-up for The Apartment. And so let us get into a quick summary of the film. Elmer Gantry is a drama based on the 1927 novel of the same name by Sinclair Lewis. It tells the story of a traveling salesman named Elmer Gantry who stumbles upon a Christian revivalist meeting led by the spirited Sharon Falconer, and Elmer uses some of his conning skills to get in with Sharon, and they agree to team up and preach the good word by using kind of a good cop, bad cop technique to sell religion to the masses. And eventually their act sort of catches on, and then we have a prostitute named Lulu who has a past with Elmer, who catches wind of him being in town, claiming to be reformed, and she decides to throw a wrench into his very carefully crafted image. And Elmer also enters a relationship with Sharon, complicating matters even further. So the film is kind of all about Elmer and Sharon doing their best to sell some of that old-time religion, while a lot of skeptics threaten to derail them. So the film was written and directed by Richard Brooks. It stars Burt Lancaster as Elmer Gantry, Gene Simmons as Sharon, Shirley Jones as Lulu, Arthur Kennedy, Dean Jagger, Patti Page, and many more. And Elmer Gantry was nominated for 5 Academy Awards and won 3, but not Best Picture. Okay, so Elmer Gantry. It starts off with this really fascinating warning, essentially.
Yeah.
Which I was quite shocked by, and I wrote it down because it was quite interesting, and I think it'll set the tone for kind of the context of when this film came out. But it says, "We believe that certain aspects of revivalism can bear examination, that the conduct of some revivalists make a mockery of the traditional beliefs and practices of organized Christianity. We believe that everyone has a right to worship according to his conscience, but freedom of religion is not licensed to abuse the faith of the people!" Exclamation point. However, due to the highly controversial nature of this film, we strongly urge you to prevent impressionable children from seeing it.
Dun dun dun.
Love a good warning before a film. So Jefferson, what is your take on Elmer Gantry?
Well, I loved it, honestly. This is my first time watching it. I was very pleasantly surprised. I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, obviously I knew about its Oscars history and who was in it. That warning notwithstanding, I didn't find much about it very shocking. I'm sure in the context of its time, it must have been more shocking than it is now. But even without that shock value, very, I found that it raised some really interesting questions. My favorite scenes were like the ones where all the ministers were debating whether to allow this revival tour to enter their city, or the scenes where Elmer Gantry is talking to the newspaper reporter about religion. All these sort of like religious and ethical and moral debates I actually found really timely, and that they're sort of debates that we're still having now. Um, and I think it's kind of interesting that this movie has faded, given how relevant it remains. Um, but I thought Burt Lancaster was great. I feel like this is one of his maybe strongest roles. It's definitely one that plays most into his like really charismatic energy. He's slightly over the top, but in a way that really fits the character. I thought Gene Simmons was absolutely spectacular, and how she wasn't nominated for Best Actress. I mean, maybe we'll talk about that more, but I think that's pretty surprising. I thought she was wonderful. Um, Shirley Jones, who I'm most familiar with from The Music Man, this was quite a different role than that.
But covering similar topics, I think.
Yes, exactly.
As well.
Covering a traveling salesman coming to small towns, and yeah. But I don't know. It's sort of surprising looking back and thinking, this in 1960, this was an Oscar-winning role. I don't know. She was good, but she's only in the movie's like 2.5 hours long, and she's really only in like 10 or 12 minutes of it.
Yeah.
And she's good. But to me, this is, I mean, the Burt Lancaster and Gene Simmons show for sure. The only issue I had with it maybe was Elmer Gantry's character at times. It was a little unclear what he wanted, I thought, because he is this con man, but what does he want? He's not really conning. He's not stealing money. What's his actual goal? Does he actually believe all the things that he's saying? I don't know. His character is a little inscrutable at times, and maybe that's a result of the movie being an adaptation of only about 100 pages of the novel.
Yeah.
Which I read about while I was researching the film. It's adapted from a Sinclair Lewis novel, and who I also discovered was he is the only American author whose books have ever been adapted into 3 Best Picture nominated films.
Hey, fun trivia fact. Yeah.
Yeah. Aerosmith, Dodsworth, and this. The only American author to get 3 Best Picture nominees out of his books. So anyway, so this movie's adapted from only about 100 pages of that novel, and maybe some of his character development is sacrificed in the process of this sort of condensed version of the story. Maybe he has more of an arc in the book itself. It sort of reminds me of how Natasha Pierre in The Great Comet of 1812 is adapted from only 70 pages of War and Peace, which I think is a really cool way to do an adaptation, to take this section of the sprawling book and sort of expand it to really capture the spirit of the novel without having to cram so much into one feature-length runtime. But maybe Elmer Gantry's character suffered a little bit in the process, but fortunately, I feel like Burt Lancaster really filled in those holes with his performance. He's so charismatic. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to talk about with this movie, but right off the bat, I have to say that I think this is a movie that more people should be watching right now. Yeah. It's fascinating that like a 59-year-old movie could be having this much relevance, but looking at its themes, I just feel like it's more relevant than ever. It's a movie that tackles religion and how certain evangelists can prey on people who are less suspecting and take advantage of them and just turn them into zealots, basically. And I think that's something we see not just like with the world of like the televangelism, but also politically. You look at how like political leaders, like our very own president, say, use these persuasive tactics to kind of lure people in when all they're really doing is selling them a bill of goods. I think what Elmer Gantry, the film, does really well is just explore how people can get caught up in a cause, how people are really taken advantage of by these leaders who half believe in what they're saying, maybe half believe, but mostly just want like money and power. And the film, I think, is really able to do that with definitely with a charismatic actor like Burt Lancaster in the lead. It's a very big, over-the-top performance, shouting at the rafters. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also a layered performance, because I think he is able to communicate with a lot of confidence, all the things he's saying. And then I think Lancaster, he's able to sort of toe the line between being this convincing preacher, but also us in the audience sort of knowing in the back of our minds that he's just selling a message that he doesn't fully believe in. And I think it's a really tricky balance. And I will agree with you that the motives of Elmer are not always clear, but in some ways that kind of makes it more fascinating for me, because it's a little bit more mysterious, and I like that it sort of does end up being a little open-ended. And I think by the end he mentioned something about how, like, I believe in God, but nothing quite on the level that he was preaching. But it's really kind of a fascinating character study in some ways. But going to Gene Simmons, she wasn't doing much for me in the beginning, I think because I didn't know exactly where she was going as a character, whether she was just going to be like the girl for Elmer to fall in love with, and that does happen. But also I think Sharon has a really fascinating arc, and she really has a good grasp on her sort of internal conflicts as she starts this relationship with a man while still being very devoted to her cause. She believes like wholeheartedly in her message, and almost thinks of herself as like a prophet-like figure in some ways. In the way she's kind of able to make excuses in her mind about some of Elmer's kind of shadier tactics is really fascinating to watch play out. But I wanted to get to Shirley Jones in particular, because I think she sort of sticks out in this movie in a way that you could interpret as good or bad. If that makes sense. So she's the supporting actress winner of the year, and I do think she brings a very different kind of energy to this film that's a little less subtle than what Elmer Gantry and Sharon are doing.
Right. It's more broad.
She's kind of a breath of fresh air, if in some ways, from kind of all the heightened intensity of like those revivalist scenes, where it's kind of like a break for a little bit of normalcy, I would argue.
Especially where she joins the film. She comes in, I looked at the time, it was exactly like an hour and 15 minutes into a 2.5 hour movie. So it's like almost exactly halfway through the movie, this, as you put it, breath of fresh air comes in.
And I think this character of Lulu, she's almost like delighting in stirring up trouble for Elmer, and it's kind of fun to watch her very, very knowingly say things and do things that she knows will kind of set things in motion. And I just have to say this one line that I also wrote down that really shocked me quite for 1960, and I think you know what I'm talking about. Where she's like, "Oh, he gave me special instructions back of the pulpit Christmas Eve. He got to howling, 'Repent, repent,' and I got to moaning, 'Save me, save me.' And the first thing I know, he rammed the fear of God into me so fast I never heard my old man's footsteps." I mean, damn.
I guess that's the scene the warning is talking about.
Right. It's I'm a little bit shocked that slipped through. But what do you think overall about what Shirley Jones brings to the film?
It's definitely a change of pace and really a change of style, kind of style of acting, style of character than we've met before. I suppose that's probably intentional, because it is supposed to feel like this jarring intrusion from Elmer's past thrust into this new life that he'd made for himself. I feel like you said, whether that works for you or not is really going to be sort of an individual thing. I don't think it entirely worked for me. I mean, I didn't think she was bad. She wasn't my favorite part of the movie. It did just feel a little, I mean, the cliche of the like sex worker with the connection to the man's past who stirs up trouble. It's like I don't know. It felt pulled from a more standard movie than the rest of it had felt up to that point. Shirley Jones does a good job with it, but like I don't know, there weren't that many different layers to the character outside of her performance. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say it is quite a standard like supporting actress Oscar winning kind of role as well.
Right.
Like you see this kind of like prostitute, not necessarily with a heart of gold, but
Right. I almost said that and I was like, well, that's not quite true. But like still like you like her. Like you're
right.
She's supposed to be she's
a little scrappy,
and, like,
yeah.
pretty and like and I don't know, the audience is supposed to like her. So not heart of gold necessarily, but like someone you're supposed to like and who's supposed to bring some fun to it. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, another thing is that even though this movie is almost 2.5 hours long, I think that it actually flows really well. I think there's a very natural rise and fall that comes kind of at the right places. Like you were saying with Lulu's introduction, like I think it's very perfectly placed to where Elmer and Sharon are sort of starting to get a lot of press in the newspapers and everything's going really great, and then suddenly we have this outside force come out of the woodwork to really complicate everything, which again is a standard kind of film trope in some ways, but I think it's again very, very well placed. And I think that's, even though like I said the film is 2.5 hours, I think the editing in particular by Marjorie Fowler, it's a lot of material to work with, but I think she's able to craft a good through line.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's really kind of interesting how like these religious figures like Sharon and some of the other priests in the film, they sort of concede that religion does need money in order to survive, and sort of even if it goes against the general spirit of what they're preaching, they have to almost be greedy to sustain their business. And I think that was a really interesting sort of theme to watch people kind of explore what they can allow sort of in their own minds.
Right.
Yeah,
and there was that one voice of dissent in the room who was like, no, like there was once there was only 13 Christians in the entire world, and was Christianity less of a success then? Like, so it was nice to get a voice on both sides of that issue, because I feel like money in religion has been a really fraught topic over the decades since this movie came out. So yeah, it was funny hearing them talk about tax-free buildings. Like that's still a topic of controversy.
Oh yeah, still very relevant, sadly. But going back to like the political aspect of this, watching this and seeing how Elmer like reads the newspaper in front of the crowd and like calls out the media, essentially accusing them of fake news. I mean, that is just chilling to me. Just watching that, I'm like, wow, okay, this is from almost 60 years ago, and it feels like it could be made right now and be like a satire,
Yeah. Maybe it's time for an Elmer Gantry remake.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I'm like, there's all these remakes lately. I feel like this is kind of a movie that might need that sort of a remake. So
yeah, and I mean, it's a really good film, but it doesn't feel like an untouchable classic in the way that some others do. I mean, I can really imagine an actor like Daniel Day-Lewis in the Elmer Gantry role and chewing up the scenery, and I don't know, I think people would be surprised by how topical it is.
Yeah, well, that's another thing I kind of observed watching the film, is that I really felt there will be blood a lot in some of these sort of this outsider who goes into this community and stirs up trouble just kind of for his own gain. I found to be Yeah.
It did make me wonder how audiences at the time reacted to its stance on religion.
I know.
No,
Yeah.
it's hard to find reports on things like that, but I mean, obviously we're viewing it through our 2019 lens, but uh, I mean, apparently the film was controversial enough to merit that disclaimer at the beginning, uh, but I don't get the sense that audiences like rioted. It didn't become like a huge controversy that like people remember to this day.
Right.
I don't know, I don't know. I don't know if they accepted it or rebelled against it. It's hard to say.
Yeah. It wasn't some big media firestorm. Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
It's funny to think of it as a period piece too, because it's a 1960s film that takes place in the 1920s, which would be like a film today taking place in the 70s, which is the past in a different era, but like the recent past to us, compared to where the 20s are now, to us, like the 20s feel like ages ago, but in the 60s they were, just a few decades earlier, and this film was already looking back on them and examining them, and yeah, it's just fun to think of the context of when the film came out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to say how an audience would react to this, because I know like they made a lot of changes from the book. Like he was like a minister, Elmer Gantry, and then they had to sort of change it for the Hays Code to make it not feel like this is like this actual minister who is now peddling this religion that is clearly something he doesn't necessarily believe in anymore. Right. So I that's a very interesting sort of key change to make, I think.
Did you read about the real woman that Sharon Falconer is loosely based on?
No. Did you?
Yeah. So she's this radio evangelist, Amy Semple McPherson, who, according to Wikipedia at least, was the loose inspiration behind Sharon Falconer. But reading her Wikipedia page is fascinating, and she seems to have much more in common with Elmer Gantry, to be honest, other than being a woman. I mean, she was this very successful evangelist, but she was rumored to have many affairs throughout her life. And there was this one period where she went missing for like 5 weeks or something like that, and the people searched everywhere for her, and people claimed to have spotted her all over the country, and they had just about given up her for dead and were planning her funeral when she turned up in Mexico claiming to have been kidnapped.
Oh my lord.
And then eventually she died of a drug overdose. And so it's like
okay.
Yeah, like fascinating story.
Let's adapt that story.
Yeah, right. So Sharon, I mean, the character of Sharon in the movie is so pure in her belief and intentions, and maybe they claim that Sharon was based on this woman, but she definitely feels more like an Elmer Gantry figure.
Well, kind of on that topic, I did think that there maybe could have been a little more explored with the fact that this is a woman who is kind of preaching these things and is this leader of this movement, because traditionally it's always been very like patriarchal in many ways.
Well, right, and someone quotes at her in the movie, women in the church shall be silent, or whatever the Bible passage is.
Right. Yeah. So I like that they actually made mention of that, but I feel like it could have been slightly explored more, because in the beginning it feels like it's kind of just accepted in a way that I don't know if it's fully realistic. I don't know.
Yeah.
One other thing in terms of the formal elements of the film, I think that the cinematography is pretty good. It's very good color cinematography by John Alton, with sort of the close-ups and sort of the sweeping nature of the revivalist meetings. I think it really feels like claustrophobic in some ways, and you can feel the sweat, and I think it's very like tactile in those moments.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like I kind of love the ending big set piece with the fire.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, this is 1960, and it's not like this can just be like a CGI sort of thing. So You really feel it like on a practical level. So I think that was really
watching,
well done.
Yeah, I was like, I wonder how many extras were like burned, how many stuntmen were like actually injured while making this, because it feels pretty real and pretty dangerous.
It really does. Yeah, it said there were like 1,200 extras and a bunch of stuntmen, and you can feel that.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention was the ways the film. I mean, you touched on money and religion, and another aspect of that is religion as entertainment.
Oh yeah.
And the way the film drew comparisons between these revival tours and like the circus at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Which, they got in a train, they traveled to a city, they set up a tent. Like literally it was the same format as the circus, going town to town. And I mean that jumped out at me. And I feel like religion in many ways, especially these big mega churches, are still more a form of entertainment than anything. And
it's the same. It's the same thing with like the political stuff as well.
Right.
These big rallies that people hold. They're very theatrical and making all these big proclamations, and it really does feel like just entertainment over anything.
Right.
And that has definitely pervaded a lot of different areas of what we deal with in America. So like I said, very timely, very very timely.
Yep.
So I just wanted to kind of close out just talking a little more about Burt Lancaster, because he really is Elmer Gantry. He totally inhabits this role, and it is very over the top, like I said. But again, I do feel like he's able to find kind of a really fascinating, mysterious element to this character, which may just be in the writing, but also I think the way he performs it. It's very enigmatic, but you're almost convinced in many ways. Like when he's singing some of the spirituals, just like full-heartedly, you feel like how can you not think that this guy is like totally in the pocket of just this belief system. So really fascinating performance.
Yeah, absolutely. He has this smile that's so wide it's uncanny.
Yeah, megawatt smile.
Yeah, and he can just hold that smile, but there's something else going on in his eyes too. Same time. Yeah.
It's a little bit terrifying.
Yeah.
So any other stray observations you want to make before we get into some of the Oscar stuff?
No, I think we've just about covered it.
Yeah, I think to kind of sum it up, it really is something that more people should watch. I do think that it's not as remembered, maybe because it doesn't quite feel like it's like advancing film technique in a way that other films that are remembered from this era are kind of lauded for. I think it's more just the story itself that I think is very much worth remembering and pun intended, reviving in some ways.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I do have sort of a theory of sorts of why it maybe isn't as remembered today. Which is, everyone remembers the great movies that lost to not so great movies. Everyone remembers Citizen Kane. But it's harder to remember the great movies that lost to great movies.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because
which is kind of what this podcast is all about.
Right. The Apartment is considered like one of the best picture winners of all time. And so when you think of the year 1916 Oscars, you think of The Apartment. And you assume that the other movies that were nominated just must not have been in the same league. But just because The Apartment was great doesn't mean that other movies nominated that year weren't also great. I mean, many of them were not great, which we'll also talk about.
Yeah.
But yeah, The Apartment was great, and another great movie lost to it. And it can be easy to overlook that. So people should definitely give this a look.
Yeah, it is 2.5 hours, but don't let that turn you off from a really fascinating, kind of thought-provoking film that comes out in an era that you wouldn't necessarily expect a film like this to be. I wouldn't call it controversial, but certainly making some waves.
Yeah.
So, When we come back, we'll be discussing why Elmer Gantry lost Best Picture to The Apartment.
And what do you really know about him? His background, his reputation. And what does he want? Money? My job? You? What?
Bill.
In 1917, Mr. Gantry was expelled from a theological seminary in Kansas for seducing a Miss Lula Baines, the deacon's daughter, in the church where he had that day delivered a Christmas sermon.
What the hell's the big idea?
Elmer.
You really think I want to sit still for a shakedown?
Baby, how could I put the squeeze
The old
on
Thatcher
you?
game, huh?
Who's going to take the word of a $5 hooker
You better
against
make it
Elmer
good.
Gantry? I only wanted to see you for...
For what?
Well, for...
For what?
What do you think will get you into God's own glorious heaven? This ace of spades? Your bank book? Or this pledge to be a good Christian?
I'd like to tear those holy wings off you, make a real woman out of you. I'd show you what heaven's like. No golden stairways or harp music or silvery clouds. Just ecstasy, coming and going. Sin, sin, sin. You're all sinners. You're all doomed to perdition.
What is a revival? Is it a church? Is it a religion? Or is it a circus sideshow complete with freaks, magic, and rabble-rousing?
You hate Gantry that much? Or do you love him that much? And you're no good to me, or yourself. You're no good to anybody. Shame, shame.
Wait.
And we're back. So now we'll be discussing why Elmer Gantry lost Best Picture to The Apartment. Elmer Gantry was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actor for Burt Lancaster, Best Supporting Actress for Shirley Jones, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Music Score of a Dramatic or Comedy Picture. And it won 3 of those, 3 out of 5, which was for Best Actor, Supporting Actress, and Adapted Screenplay. So I will just say that this was a bit of a tough call to decide what the runner-up to The Apartment was, because this was another wacky year where only 3 Best Picture nominees were nominated in Director. Mm-hmm. One of them was not Elmer Gantry, but Elmer Gantry wins 2 acting awards and a screenplay award over a lot of the other contenders as well. So this was a bit of a tough call, but I went with this just because looking at all of the films themselves, I think Elmer Gantry was the most feeling like a traditional sort of Best Picture winner.
Yeah.
Even though I'm definitely not surprised that The Apartment ends up beating it. I think it shares enough elements with other picture winners in this general era that it felt the most like it would come closest. So before the Oscars, Elmer Gantry won the WGA award, and then The Apartment basically swept everything, including the Golden Globe, BAFTA, DGA, the New York Film Critics, and WGA. So largely speaking, this was kind of done and done as far as The Apartment was going to win Best Picture, was the front runner, all of that. So just on a thematic level, why do we think that The Apartment ends up winning and that Elmer Gantry does not quite get there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like The Apartment is I mean, obviously Billy Wilder was so famous at the time. I mean, he'd already won in 45 for The Lost Weekend, and he had just wasn't Some Like It Hot was just the year before this, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and that was a huge success, and so he was coming off the success of that. And Jack Lemmon, already an Oscar winner, up-and-comer Shirley MacLaine. It's such a witty script. And I was actually watching this for the first time as well. This was a hole in my Oscar knowledge, and I don't know. I was surprised by how dark it was.
Oh yeah,
I was not expecting that. So like it has the trappings and the witty banter of a rom-com, but really explores some deeper themes and goes to some dark places that you wouldn't expect. I don't know if personally I don't know if I liked it better than Elmer Gantry. I think I don't know. That's tough. They're very different, and that might be blasphemous to say, but I can see why at the time, especially if Elmer Gantry was controversial. I can see why The Apartment was an easy, more popular pick. Yeah.
Yeah. This is kind of like not what I typically say when it comes to this portion of the show, but I just genuinely think that The Apartment won because it was the best movie. And just like in terms of just everything working at the top level, even though this is like this I wouldn't necessarily say romantic comedy, but just kind of a screwball comedy in some ways. It goes to some dramatic places like you were saying, but has a little bit more of like the contemporary tone, and you know is not necessarily that big sweeping epic sort of best picture winner that you would expect from this era quite a bit, but it's just I think everyone operating at the top of their games, and is a really interesting, speaking of kind of satirizing kind of an era, I think it does really well with sort of the corporate era of coming off of the 50s especially. I think it does that really well. I think
an alternate title for the film could be How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So I just think it has a lot of relatability in many ways, especially to the Jack Lemmon character, that I feel like a lot of people can identify with him in particular. Not necessarily the situation he's in, but just the feeling of wanting to succeed in business, but is just finding such conflict within himself and with others, and he's just kind of he's a regular guy, and he feels like he wants to be with this girl, but she's with the wrong man, and it's just an appealing, realistic sort of film. Whereas with Elmer Gantry, I think there's a lot of really fascinating characters and themes and relevance, but might be featuring characters that are a little too more on the negative side overall, if that makes sense. A little murkier in terms of their intentions and their motivations. So I think that's a big factor in this. But I will generally agree that these are kind of the top two contenders here by a long shot, personally speaking. So
yeah, then it's really surprising in that case. I mean, if we're talking about literally why did Elmer Gantry not win? Well, it didn't have a Best Director nomination, which, I mean, used to be a death knell. I mean, used to be you could not win for a very long time. You could not win without a Best Director nomination.
Right.
And it's really surprising given that it won 3 Oscars and seems like it was a heavy runner-up, that it missed that nomination. I wonder if you have any theories as to why.
Yeah, not entirely sure in this case, other than just the other films nominated in director, I think makes sense in terms of Never on Sunday and Psycho, which are both very director-friendly films in a way that is even more impressive in some ways than what Elmer Gantry and arguably the Alamo are doing. So I think it's just kind of the tough competition that ultimately ends up squeezing it out. I don't know if the direction is quite flashy enough for Best Director, and even like I was praising like some of the cinematography and the editing, but I don't know if it's the showiest necessarily. So,
but is Fred Zinnemann's direction of The Sundown that much more flashy? I mean, he was nominated for Best Director, what, 1, 4, 5, 6, 7 times and won twice? Like, is this really one that he needed, you know? Like,
no, he did not. But again, this is another film that has some of the formal elements to it, like the cinematography of the Australian outback, which is where it takes place, that feels like on a visual level more interesting, even though the film itself is certainly not. So, and then Jack Cardiff for Sons and Lovers it's like a kind of a domestic drama, so you wouldn't expect that to be quite as flashy either, but it has a good sort of visual sense in terms of its cinematography that, again, I feel like it's sort of flashy in some ways. So it's really hard to say. I don't know if it's a personal thing against Richard Brooks because he won screenplay, so I don't know.
Right, yeah.
So let's get into a few questions here that we had for both Elmer Gantry and The Apartment. Well, this was from Amy Thomason, who said, how was Gene Simmons not nominated for Best Actress in Elmer Gantry? And why is Elmer Gantry so ignored today? It's still very relevant. Agreed, as we noted.
Yep.
Yeah, what do we think about Gene Simmons getting snubbed?
I mean, I think it's outrageous. I don't know that I have a super ironclad theory as to why she was snubbed, other than, I mean, when you look at the Best Actress lineup, you have Greer Garson, Deborah Kerr, Shirley MacLaine, Melina Mercury, yeah, and Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, the two of those 5 women that weren't nominated for Golden Globes were Melina Mercury and who was the second one? I think it was Deborah Kerr, yeah, and this came in an era when the Oscars were really into recognizing like Italian and Greek and French cinema.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's why someone like Melina Mercury would get in here for Never on Sunday, even if she hadn't been really present in the race elsewhere. And I mean, Deborah Kerr's Deborah Kerr, and unfortunately the Sundowners did do well with the Oscars that year. I mean, they love a very handsome production with famous people in it. And I don't know. I guess what Gene Simmons doing might have been perceived as relatively simple. I mean, I think there's definitely more to her performance than that, but man, I would certainly put her in there. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was not sure about the performance in the beginning, but by the end, she really sold me. So I might just be like a tricky character for some people, where they don't, sometimes there is kind of the factor of relatability, and I don't know if maybe the character on the page just wasn't necessarily flashy enough, even though it is a very interesting character, as we've outlined. It's really, her arc is really something. But I really kind of struggle with why she doesn't get in. I genuinely don't know.
Yeah, she was nominated for a BAFTA. She was nominated for a Globe, and the film did really well. And I mean, it was nominated in 2 acting categories and won both of them. The actors liked the film.
Oh yeah.
It's sort of a mystery.
Yeah, I think maybe just the competition was a little too tough.
Yeah.
Overall, because I've seen 4 out of 5 of these Best Actress winners. I haven't seen Sunrise at Campobello. Sorry, Greer Garson, but
as Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean,
yeah, I know, but
I mean, that's why she got in.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the name of the character she's playing.
Exactly. But the rest of the competition, I think even though Shirley MacLaine in The Apartment is a co-lead, I think the others really command their films in a way maybe more than what Gene Simmons is doing. So I don't know, something like that.
I wonder if maybe there wasn't. No, I was gonna say I wonder if it maybe wasn't category confusion, and because I mean it is more of a co-lead than a female lead, and so I wonder if maybe they tried to slot her into supporting and it didn't work. But
that's true.
But then you look at the Golden Globes and the BAFTAs, and she was definitely in lead there. So I don't know. It may just forever be a mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, and we will certainly get to another big snub later on. I'll leave that one hanging. So let's get to the apartment questions. This was from H3. How did Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine both not win for their performances? Could make a case that their career best performances are in this film.
Yeah, it is a little surprising that no actors from that movie won. Like I mentioned before, though, I mean, Jack Lemmon already had an Oscar at this time. I mean, sure, it was in supporting, and he'd have to wait until the 70s to get his lead Oscar. But, Burt Lancaster did not have one yet. And, I mean, I feel like, sadly, that does, that does weigh on people's minds, who already has an Oscar and who doesn't. Unless you're Glenn Close, then nobody cares.
Well, we don't have to bring that up. Somehow it just gets into the discussion every week.
I mean, you have to take into account the circumstances around Elizabeth Taylor's win, which is she was having some real health difficulties at the time, and people weren't sure if she was ever going to be nominated again. I mean, obviously, in retrospect, it's easy to be like, oh, well, I wish Shirley MacLaine had just won there instead because Elizabeth Taylor was going to win again just 6 years later for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But of course, nobody knew that at the time.
Right.
And this was her 4th nomination in a row. She'd been nominated every year for 4 years in a row. And people weren't sure if she was ever going to be nominated again. It's really not surprising that she won, I think. Even for a film as not great as Butterfield 8.
Right. Elizabeth Taylor in Butterfield 8 is quite showy.
Right.
The character is just a mess, but it's such a Beatty performance that it is kind of clear when you combine that with her narrative that it was just going to be her. Like, at a certain point, I was reading an Inside Oscar that, like, once they found out that Elizabeth Taylor was going to have, like, a tracheotomy and that she had pneumonia and that her life was in danger, the rest of the nominees were just like, I'm not even going to bother attending.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I just think, I think they probably knew that Shirley MacLaine would have more opportunities to win. She's only like 25 when The Apartment comes out, so
she'd have to wait another 23 years though.
I know, but
yeah.
I'm sure they didn't know that at the time. They assumed she would still be kind of making these kinds of great roles, which she was, but it just never happened for her until then.
And it's so funny that Elizabeth Taylor won her first Oscar for this role in particular when she only made this movie so she could get out of her contract with the studio. She had one film left on her contract with the studio, and she wanted to leave the studio so she could go make Cleopatra.
Yeah.
So she was like, fine, I'll just make this dumb movie that nobody's going to care about. And it was a huge box office hit. She won the Oscar, and then Cleopatra was such a mess, and she wasn't even nominated for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. And I just love also reading about how, like, the film was a box office hit, and then she was just like, yeah, I still think it sucks.
Yeah.
Like, just openly trashing her own movie. Gotta love Elizabeth Taylor. Ugh. But going to Jack Lemmon really quick, I think he's phenomenal in The Apartment. It's one of these performances that, like, you look at it in a vacuum and you're like, how did he not win for this? Because it's just he's just at the top of his game, I think. But again, when you look at Burt Lancaster and what he's doing in Elmer Gantry, it's almost even more showy.
Right.
So,
it's definitely more showy, yeah.
Yeah, so it's tough.
Yeah.
But going back to Amy Thomason, she said, discuss the Best Supporting Actor category. How did Fred MacMurray not get nominated for Best Supporting, let alone win? So, Fred MacMurray is in The Apartment, just for clarification,
right.
And he plays Sheldrake.
Mm-hmm.
I will totally co-sign that sentiment. I think he is phenomenal in The Apartment as the foil, essentially. And it's just really just fantastic in that kind of a role.
Yeah. I mentioned that, category confusion might have been a factor in Gene Simmons, but I think it was definitely a factor here.
Yeah.
I think you could easily think of him as a co-lead, or as a supporting character. I mean, when you look at the supporting character who was nominated for this movie, Jack Kruschen as the neighbor, Dr. Dreyfus. I mean, that's a much smaller role. And I think in general, I mean, people, get all up in arms about the supporting categories these days, and there is some merit to that, because when you look back at the history of the supporting category, it really did used to be these small roles where a person came into a film for maybe 10 minutes and left a lasting impression. It really wasn't, ground to spread out some co-lead categories so they weren't competing with each other. I mean, people really took the supporting categories seriously as just featured players in a larger story. And I think Fred MacMurray really straddles the line. He is in a lot of the movie. He's definitely in more of the movie than I feel like most of the nominees in that category that year. And I don't know where they tried to campaign him, but I wouldn't be surprised if vote splitting was an issue there.
Yeah, and it also just goes back to that thing of like stars being in supporting.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a big factor, especially at this time where Fred MacMurray had previously been very well known for leading in Double Indemnity, and so. Mm-hmm. There might have been a sense like leave supporting actor for the sort of character actors sort of thing.
Right.
So you might be right about that.
But it is, never nominated in his career.
Yeah.
Could have been nominated for Double Indemnity, could have been nominated here. And he never quite managed it. It's a shame.
Yeah. This was from Joe Gouveia, who basically asked the same question about why Fred MacMurray wasn't nominated, but also, do we think he would have beaten Peter Ustinov if he was nominated?
That's tough. Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. Hard to say. I think looking back on winners from that year, there wasn't really a consensus pick. Peter Ustinov did not, from what I can tell, didn't win anything major before the Oscars. It looks like Sal Mineo won the Golden Globe. And who won the NBR? George Peppard? Well, not an Oscar nominee.
Right.
Won the NBR. So yeah, I mean, if there wasn't consensus, it's possible.
I don't think he would. That's what I would say. I think Peter Ustinov is very showy, and in Spartacus, it's a classic supporting character, and I think maybe what Fred MacMurray is doing in The Apartment is just a smidge too slimy
it's pretty slimy
for people to get behind. So that's what I would say.
It would have been a good way, but if people were looking for an excuse to give the Best Picture winner one acting win, I mean, I was just thinking of a comparison. Who was it? It fled my mind. Never mind. Moving on.
All right. So let's get to some of these other Best Picture nominees. So like I kind of said earlier, I don't think any of these are quite on the level of The Apartment or Elmer Gantry for that matter.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. I remembered my comparison, which was All About Eve.
Oh, okay.
Which also famously didn't win either of its lead acting nominations, but did win in supporting actor for George Sanders, who's not the first person anyone thinks of when they think of All About Eve, but, they wanted to give that film an acting win.
Yeah,
so
that's a good point.
It could have been a similar situation. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. So the other nominees in this category were The Alamo, Sons and Lovers, and The Sundowners. And so I guess starting with the ones that I liked the most, which would be Sons and Lovers, which is basically another title you could give to Psycho, but that's another matter. Lots of interesting Oedipus complex in this particular Oscar year. So it's kind of like a little bit of like the kitchen sink sort of domestic drama about kind of like a coming of age of this young man who dreams of sort of leaving his coal mining town and has these affairs with an older woman and also someone of his own age, while also kind of having this close relationship with his mother. And so Like I said, just a really interesting sort of shot composition and cinematography from Freddie Francis. Really good use of black and white. I think it's generally good. It's the kind of movie that I like in terms of sort of like the Last Picture Show, sort of ordinary people almost sort of thing, but not quite reaching that level overall. And we didn't get any questions about it, so no one cares. The other one, well, I should say kind of the bottom two, I would kind of put them in the same tier, generally speaking, is The Alamo and The Sundowners. So The Alamo is the big John Wayne production. He directs it. He basically is wanting to make this film for like over a decade, and he really just pours everything into this sort of ode to the past, and it's just not for me. It's just these kinds of films that are very like uber patriotic in terms of like exploring the past and these heroes through rose-colored glasses without very much like introspection or exploring any dark territory at all. It's not my bag. So I can't say that I really recommend it, and I know that there's a big campaign by John Wayne in particular, and he basically in the press called people un-American if they did not vote for the Alamo for these big prizes. And so that's just John Wayne being John Wayne. But there was something in particular that I wanted to highlight here, which was a question from Joey Gentili saying, can someone just mention the hilarity of the Chill Wills campaign controversy? That's all I ask.
Oh my God. Yes.
So you know about this?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Chill Wills is this very comedic sort of character actor playing the character of Beekeeper in The Alamo. It's kind of a joke of a nomination in my opinion, but regardless, Chill Wills really campaigned aggressively hard for himself.
Yeah, if you think John Wayne campaigned hard.
Yeah, this was just a mess.
Chill Wills campaigned so hard that John Wayne denounced him.
Right, he was like...
John Wayne was campaigning hard.
Exactly. Yeah, so he
Chill
hires...
Wills basically, like, decades before Melissa Leo, basically launched his own For Your Consideration campaign.
Yes.
Yeah. He basically said that his fellow cast members were praying for him to win the Oscar even harder than the defenders of the Alamo were praying to survive the battle.
Yep. That is correct. And yeah, he hired like a campaign manager for himself to someone with the nickname Bow Wow. Just throwing that out there. And yeah, put out this big ad saying that everyone was like praying for him and called his castmates his Alamo cousins. And meanwhile, like none of the cast actually like corroborated this. Like they were not praying for him. They did not co-sign any of this. They didn't even know it was happening. John Wayne didn't know it was happening. So
yeah.
It was a disaster, and it was just kind of like a back and forth in the trades, like the Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, of just like people just taking out ads in response to this. It was like
Groucho Marx took out an ad.
Yes, which is fantastic. He took out an ad that said, "Dear Mr. Chill Wills, I am delighted to be your cousin, but I voted for Sal Mineo." Which is the shadiest shit. I just love it.
Yeah.
I just like I say every week, I just love this era of just like openly being very competitive about the Oscars.
Yeah.
In a way that nobody would these days, barring Melissa Leo, of course. But
right. And then in the end, it only won one Oscar for Best Sound.
Yeah, a measly sound winner. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's just like I said, not for me. The other movie in this race is The Sundowners, where it's kind of just about this family of nomads, basically, who kind of go from town to town in Australia. And that's about it. Like, it's not really a film that has a very concrete plot.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of pretty shots of the Australian countryside and kind of just about occasional marital strife, but they ultimately just get along to get along. And
I had always assumed that it was like a drama about old people and dementia, since sundowning is a thing.
Right.
So imagine my surprise when I find out it's just an Australian,
yeah,
countryside.
Right.
I was like, oh.
It's
okay.
basically, I was listening to the Film Experience podcast because they very recently actually did a breakdown of the supporting actress nominees of 1960. And it was very good because at one point they were just talking about how The Sundowners is basically just like a travel log.
Yeah.
Or like, this
Visit Australia.
Yeah, basically just an advertisement for like how beautiful Australia can be and how like quirky, and here's like sheep running around and there's horses and it's just everyone's having a great old time. Anyway,
I imagine films like that were like a vacation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Let's go to Australia and just make a movie.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because it's not like you had like the internet or anything where you could just like see anything anytime. It's just like kind of this glimpse into another culture, essentially, of the outback. So I really was watching this wondering what the point of this was, and got to the end of 141 minutes and discovered that there was none. So that's always fun. Deborah Carr is good in this. She has a nice warm energy to her. Otherwise, I struggle to see why this is even in the conversation. Like, in some ways, I understand why the Alamo is there, because it kind of is this historical epic sort of thing. But looking at the Sundowners, like, I guess it's charming in some ways, but I don't know why it's in Best Picture.
Yeah.
So basically, to wrap that up, I don't really recommend most of this Best Picture lineup outside of the two that we've been talking about.
Yep.
Yeah. So unless we have any other thoughts, we can move on to our Should Have Been a Contender segment.
Let's do it.
Where we can talk about much more interesting films that were not nominated for Best Picture, any old film that came out in 1960. All right, so Jefferson, I think we know what the big one to talk about here is, and you can just say it right now.
Yeah, well, it's this little film that, I don't know, a lot of people might not have heard of it. It's called, like, Psycho?
Psycho, yes. It's a foreign film.
Yes. No, Psycho, obviously. It made it into Best Director. And should have been in a lot more. Made it into supporting actress, but did not make it into picture or actor or score, which honestly might be one of the film's biggest snubs. That is an all-time iconic score.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Academy was never high on Hitchcock. I mean, they gave him Best Picture once for Rebecca, but they never gave him Best Director. And I don't think it's super surprising that a horror movie didn't make it into Best Picture in 1960. But I mean, you know, in 2019, looking back, it's the film that absolutely should be there. I feel like the film that, in the context of 1960, is more surprising that it's not there is Spartacus. Mm-hmm. Just considering its other award success that season. I mean, it won the Golden Globe. It was the #1 grossing film of the entire year. You know, it won an acting award, but missed out on Best Picture for some reason. So, I mean, those are the two big ones for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But
just to dive a little deeper into Psycho, which is really the big film for me for this year, that honestly, like, Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Original Score, not getting into any of those is genuinely offensive. It really makes no sense. Well, it does make sense, but it's not right, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Because a perfect example, we get this question from Venny War, who said, is Psycho the biggest snub of the year? Was Anthony Perkins totally snubbed of a Best Actor nomination?
Yes,
the answer is yes. It is one of the most iconic performances in film history. Yeah. And I really genuinely think the only reason that he and some elements of the film are not nominated is because of horror bias.
Right.
And so that's really very unfortunate, because he creates one of the most fascinating psychological character studies kind of all time, really, where you are a little bit charmed by him in many ways. And it's not necessarily like a sympathetic performance in terms of like you're rooting for him, but you really kind of are compelled by him, and it's a very alluring performance in a way that just sticks with you, and it has stuck with people for decades and decades. And I mean, it's just really by the end, coming down to that shot where he's just looking directly into the camera with those beautiful dark eyes that are so sinister at the same time, it's right there. It's like, how do you not nominate that?
Yeah, I mean, and we've made strides recently in recognizing more. I mean, I say we, I mean the Academy has made strides recently in recognizing more genre films and performances. But even in 2018, they still couldn't nominate Toni Collette, who had won the lion's share of critics' prizes that year for a horror film. So I don't feel like it's super surprising that 59 years ago they would have shied away from nominating someone for a slasher film.
Yeah.
It feels undeniable now in retrospect, and it was the number 2 highest grossing movie of the year after Spartacus. Mm-hmm. So it probably had a lot of popular support. I'm curious if the general public was outraged by the snubs, like we are by like Toni Collette snubs these days.
Yeah, I don't know. And I just think there was a level of snobbery going on when it came to Psycho, where, it can get some of these nominations. It can even get into Best Director. But when it comes to Best Picture, it's like, I don't know if we want this sort of film like representing the best in American cinema sort of thing. I don't know. Yeah. But then Jeffrey Kerr asked, if you were to give Psycho a Best Picture nomination, which I think we both would, clearly, which of the actual nominees would you have personally bumped out for it?
I mean, literally any of them other than The Apartment and Elmer Gantry.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, even though I put them in the same bottom tier, I'm going to single out The Alamo just to spite John Wayne.
Yeah, and then let's take out The Sundowners and put in Spartacus.
Yeah, and then you have a pretty perfect lineup.
And then, boom.
Yeah, I'm good with that. I'm very good with that.
Great, we have rewritten history. Moving on.
Yes, this is what this show is all about.
I will update the Wikipedia page accordingly.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
I can live in that reality for a little while. So Ian Balakalak said, would you say that Psycho was not only robbed of a Best Picture nomination, but also Best Original Score? Yes, obviously. Duh. We look at what won that category, which is Exodus by Ernest Gold, and you even look at some of the other nominees, and you're like, I mean, none of these compare to what Bernard Herrmann did with Psycho.
None of them compare, but yeah, I mean, some of them deserve to be there and wouldn't be the ones that I would remove. I mean, Elmer Bernstein is, legendary composer for The Magnificent Seven. Yeah, leave that one in, fine. I quite liked the score for Elmer Gantry. You can leave that one in.
Yeah, it was solid.
But, yeah, we can probably take the Alamo out again.
I'd love to just keep stripping nominations from the Alamo. Oh boy, yeah. It should have like 7 or 8 nominations.
I mean, I'm glad it did get in for art direction and cinematography.
Yes, that is very good.
Which good, yeah.
And by the way, I watched it again just this week, and I think it should have won cinematography over Sons and Lovers.
Yeah.
Just the way that, even in the first third of the film, the way Janet Leigh is framed is like so gripping, and you combine that obviously with the Bernard Herrmann music, and even though it's these kind of very regular things happening to Janet Leigh's character, it's still like you're sensing the tension. Something's gonna happen.
Yeah.
So
I feel like another underrated category it should have made it into is film editing.
oh my God, yes.
And I mean, you could easily take out. I mean, I'm looking at that list. Geez, what a awful list. I mean, Pepe, a 3-hour-long musical comedy that was a total flop. Like, why is that in there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for the shower sequence alone, I mean, has there ever been a more famous like series of cuts than that sequence? I mean, cuts, pun intended.
Yes. Yeah, it's like the textbook 101 sort of film editing thing you look at for great editing. So, yeah, just a sad situation overall in terms of Psycho. But
and with this would be Hitchcock's last Best Director nomination, right?
Yeah, I believe that's true. Yeah.
So he was never quite got his due.
No, they gave him the honorary award, and he's just like, thanks.
Yeah. Gee.
Yeah. Well, actually, this
even gave him Best Director when he won Best Picture. They gave it to John Ford, who won 4 times. He's the most winning director in history, and they had to give him one over Hitchcock. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, well, that leads perfectly into this next question from Labor Law Alex, who said, so why does the Academy treat Hitchcock as a pariah during his strongest run of films, only getting director noms for Psycho and Rear Window, while Vertigo and North by Northwest get lost completely? Why the animosity?
I mean, genre, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I just think there wasn't enough respect for what he was doing as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, North by Northwest came out the year before. It was 59, the year before we're talking about. It did get a screenplay nomination, which is good. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's that simple, sadly. I just think they weren't interested in nominating the quote-unquote pulpy, this is for the masses. They're so easily entertained. We're going to nominate these highbrow Australian outback productions.
Yes, much more prestige there. Yeah.
People remember the Sundowners way more than Psycho, 60 years from now.
The Sundowners, it's a sensation. Yes. Anyway, moving on to Spartacus. I think honestly, like, this is the film that should have been what the Alamo was in this particular year.
Yeah.
Like, it very easily kind of should replace that because they have a lot of similarities, but also Stanley Kubrick as a director has a lot more of an artistic integrity than what John Wayne is doing, and he kind of has a better grasp again on the psychology of everyone, really. So
I always forget that Spartacus is Kubrick, and every time I remember, I'm like surprised all over again.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. It came like it's not even like early Kubrick. It's like middle of his career, but it is just before he really took off with that run of Doctor Strangelove was 4 years after this. And Doctor Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, which is really more of the Kubrick that we think of. But this is sort of Kubrick operating in like Cecil B. DeMille kind of Ten Commandments territory. But I mean, it's still beautiful and definitely a Kubrick film. And it's wild that it missed #1 film of the year, like won the Golden Globe. Where was it? What happened?
I don't know. I don't know if it was a studio thing. There's lots of campaigning and politicking happening, especially like I said with the Alamo. But I almost wonder if kind of the controversy with having Dalton Trumbo involved might have done something to it. Because otherwise, I don't know. It's another one that's really hard to explain, and harder to explain than the Psycho snubs even. Because like you said, it's very much in the wheelhouse of what they were liking at the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the context of the time, it's a much more surprising snub. Didn't Dalton Trumbo work on another film that same year too? Oh yeah, Exodus. And Spartacus were both him. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, neither of them got into Best Picture. So I mean, maybe you're onto something there. Who knows?
Or screenplay, notably.
Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Yes. Well, this was from Greg Adams, who we just answered this question, but I just wanted to note that he asked it. How did Spartacus win 4 awards and not get nominated for Best Picture? Yeah, so it wins supporting actor, it wins art direction, cinematography, and costume design. So, yeah, it's the winningest film. Not the winningest. It's The Apartment wins 1 more, but the fact that it's right up there, it gets 6 nominations, wins 4 of them, is kind of absurd.
Yeah,
like I said,
it's not in Best Picture.
Yeah. And then this was from Daniel Brilliant, who said, "Do you think Spartacus would have been nominated in an expanded lineup?" I think 100%.
Absolutely. It must have been number 6. I can't imagine that anything was ahead of it. It must have just missed.
Yeah.
You have to assume. Yeah.
Yeah, even though Stanley Kubrick does not get nominated in director, I do think it was right there at number 6.
Right. I think the more interesting question is, do you think Psycho would have made it in an expanded lineup? If they'd had 9 or 10 nominees, do you think even then would Psycho have made it in?
I would like to say yes. Like, I'm trying to think of other films that would have gotten over it. But I guess Never on Sunday would be right there.
Yeah, I mean, it did get the Best Director nomination, so...
Yeah.
So it probably wouldn't have been like 6 or 7. That probably would have been like Spartacus and Exodus, and then maybe Inherit the Wind.
Yeah.
And like Psycho, I think it would have made it in, but it would have been like 8.
Just barely makes it in, right?
Yeah.
All right, so this... going back a little bit to Butterfield 8, since we touched on it a little bit earlier, but Andrew Carden said, "Does Shirley MacLaine win Best Actress here if not for Liz Taylor's pneumonia/coma/death of Mike Todd? And if so, does she still win for Terms of Endearment?"
She didn't die.
Right.
Yeah.
For the record, did not die, but... yeah, I think that was a huge part of it. In terms of Shirley MacLaine winning here and whether it would affect her eventually winning again, possibly for Terms of Endearment, I think I would say that they would give it to Deborah Winger for Terms of Endearment.
Yeah, I think that's possible, and I do definitely think that Shirley MacLaine would have won. I think she was absolutely second.
Yeah. Cool.
She won pretty much she won the Golden Globe, she won the BAFTA, and she was what, 25 when she did Department, and it was her second nomination, and so it's sort of like, I mean, it would have been very similar to like the Jennifer Lawrence trajectory. You get nominated once, you know, her first nomination would have been The Winter's Bone, and then this would have been her Silver Linings Playbook,
right?
And yeah, I mean. I don't know. I don't know, though, about Terms of Endearment. I mean, it's possible that Deborah Winger would have won, but, I mean, it's not like it's not like Terms of Endearment was just a few years later. We're talking about 23 years later. I mean, she could have won a second.
Yeah.
Or maybe they even end up splitting the vote if Shirley MacLaine had more support. You know, maybe she and Deborah Winger split the vote, and then who else was nominated that year?
Meryl Streep in Silkwood.
Well, she had just won, so she wasn't going.
Julie Walters in Educating Rita was probably up there.
Oh,
and then Jane Alexander in Testament.
Yeah, I guess nobody else was going to win.
I think either way, a Terms of Endearment lady was going to win that category.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a given that Shirley MacLaine would have lost if she'd already won 23 years earlier.
Right, I agree. And we literally just saw that with like Frances McDormand winning.
Right.
Kind of in the same sort of general...
And Meryl Streep.
And Meryl Streep, yeah. So it happens.
Yeah. It would have been a more interesting race, but...
For sure.
The outcome might not have been different. Who knows?
Yes. So going to Jackson DeStefano, who proposes an interesting question, saying, "It's 1961. Academy voting has just started, and you are an Academy voter. You loved The Apartment. You love Shirley MacLaine. You want her to win Best Actress. However, Elizabeth Taylor has just nearly died from a variety of illnesses. You don't know if she will get another chance at an Oscar. Meanwhile, Shirley is young and has a bright career ahead of her. Surely she must win another one."
Surely.
Yeah, exactly. do you vote for Elizabeth Taylor's potential swan song in Butterfield 8, or do you vote for the good performance? I like the way you phrased that.
The good performance.
So this comes down to the sort of, do you go with the narrative of what was happening, or do you go in the vacuum, what was the best performance?
I like to think that I'd be the kind of person who just goes for the best performance. And I think I would be. I was never on board. God, here comes Glenn Close again.
Oh, Lord. I'm getting triggered more and more.
Yeah, she would not have had my vote. Do I think she deserves to win an Oscar? Yeah, but I wouldn't have voted for her for The Wife just to get her an Oscar.
Okay.
And on the other end of things, like I don't think that just because someone's young and has other chances doesn't mean they don't deserve to win. I mean, hello, all of Timothée Chalamet's supporters. People were like, "Oh, he's 21. He's got plenty of chances." Yeah, but he delivered the best performance in the category that year and should have won. So, yeah, I mean, I think Shirley MacLaine would have had my vote.
Yes. Well, I am someone who can struggle when it comes to figuring out whether to set aside sort of the politics, quote unquote, of a winner. Like, again, maybe I would think that Olivia Colman was better than Glenn Close, but knowing me, I think I would clearly have voted for Glenn Close anyway, just because to get her an Oscar. So I do wonder if I was 1961 and I was kind of prone to that sort of same sentiment and was like, oh, well, might as well give it to Elizabeth Taylor because this might be our last chance. But I'm just going to say that since it's a hypothetical that I would have voted for Shirley MacLaine because I love her and I love the film. I think Butterfield 8 is horrendous. And I think Elizabeth Taylor is doing her best with a very terrible character. But it's just one of these things where, again, it's not like a Glenn Close, Olivia Colman sort of thing where I feel like they're both on a good, strong level. Where it's like...
Right. There's one that's so clearly better here. Right.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say I would have gone for Shirley MacLaine.
Right. But you know what might be another factor here, though, is that like The Apartment is so much about the chemistry between the two leads. Mm-hmm. And if maybe there was a certain amount of like, well, if one of them's not winning, like, does it make sense to nominate just Shirley MacLaine by herself and like not her co-star who she has such amazing chemistry with? And I don't know. So maybe that was a factor too.
Yeah, these things happen. But then again, you also have something like Jennifer Lawrence winning for Silver Linings Playbook, who had wonderful chemistry with Bradley Cooper.
True. So. But a similar thing might have been part of, the whole thing around Bradley Cooper and A Star Is Born. Lady Gaga was not going to win, and Bradley Cooper was the front runner for a long time, and they had great chemistry. But once it became clear that Lady Gaga wasn't going to win, then I guess the other half of that coupling wasn't going to win either. And here comes Rami Malek.
Yes. Here we go, dragging up 2018, the whole thing.
Parallels.
Yes, I know.
History repeats itself.
Truly. I want to bring up a few other films that came out this year. We mentioned Inherit the Wind. We just talked about Stanley Kramer with Judgment at Nuremberg. We have
a courtroom drama.
We have yet another courtroom drama, and for that matter, it's another film like Elmer Gantry talking about sort of the religion versus sort of the Darwinism sort of thing. So a really kind of fun, entertaining courtroom drama there with, once again, Spencer Tracy at the helm. Just really, it's a fun watch, I would say, if you like sort of the sort of lawyer arguing cases sort of thing. That's very much what this is.
Yeah.
The Virgin Spring comes out this year by Ingmar Bergman. Mm-hmm. And it is the best foreign language film winner of this year. This is a brutal film to watch. It's kind of like a rape and revenge sort of thriller sort of thing.
That's the inspiration for Straw Dogs, right? Or no, for The Last House on the Left. Last House on the Left, yeah.
Right, yeah. So, but at the same time, just really striking to watch. And kind of seeing this sort of unfiltered sort of film in 1960, and you compare that with all the films that all the other films that I was watching for 1960, and it's just such a stark comparison looking at the two of them. I'm a big fan of Ingmar Bergman to begin with, but this is a really good sort of very low budget film that is able to still really affect you on a visceral level.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. Never on Sunday I watched because it was very short and easily available. Yeah, it's only a 90-minute film. It's a cute little film. It's like a little bit of kind of the sort of film where it's like the American who meets this exotic woman while he's in Greece, and she's very vivacious, and she's like a prostitute, and she's kind of just living her life, but then here comes this man who wants to like fix her. So in terms of like the gender politics, it's a little murky, but at the same time it's another kind of fun film in this race that goes to some interesting territory, I guess. Also, I just wanted to bring up the Little Shop of Horrors because the initial Little Shop of Horrors, not the musical, comes out this year. Mm-hmm. And I saw this, bringing it back to my film studies class, saw this at that time, and I was very disappointed that it was not the musical one. Because they were like, oh, we're going to watch Little Shop of Horrors. I'm like, oh, great, this is going to be fun. And then it was not. So the musical's better.
Yeah.
Anyway, did you have any other little films here you wanted to mention?
Well, there was The Facts of Life, which is sort of a screwball comedy starring Bob Hope and Lucille Ball.
Fun.
It was written and directed by Melvin Frank and Norman Panama, who they did a lot of comedies together. They did White Christmas. Mm-hmm. Melvin Frank would do, about a decade after this, he would do A Touch of Class, which won Glenda Jackson Best Actress. And I just can't help but wish that this movie could have done, that The Facts of Life could have done the same for Lucille Ball as A Touch of Class did for Glenda Jackson. How cool would it have been for Lucille Ball to have won an Oscar?
Absolutely. And especially with this lineup, like I would kind of be fine with her beating Shirley MacLaine rather than Elizabeth Taylor beating Shirley MacLaine. Anyway, yeah.
A couple, probably not Oscar, heavyweight Oscar contenders, but a couple popular movies that came out that year were The Magnificent Seven and Ocean's 11. Both came out this year.
Yes.
And both obviously movies that were later remade for honor audiences. The Magnificent Seven did make it into score, but that's it. Ocean's 11 didn't pop up anywhere at the Oscars. But
yeah.
What else? Breathless came out this year, the Godard film.
Yes, I don't think it was eligible for American awards, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it must not. I mean, it didn't even make it into a foreign film, so I hope there's an eligibility issue there.
Yeah. This happens a lot with this kind of era where the foreign language films were eligible in certain years they came out in their own country, but then the films would come out in America either 1, 2, or even like 3 or 4 years later.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like we've already touched on most of the, like, it's a pretty thin year. Honestly.
Generally.
I mean, you could easily slot Spartacus and Psycho into Best Picture, but then after that, you're sort of like, well, I mean, maybe Inherit the Wind, maybe Never on Sunday,
right?
Maybe Exodus. I don't know. It's not the strongest year.
Yeah, I know. I agree. But certainly has interesting little pockets of interest here.
Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm.
One other thing I wanted to mention is this was the last year that they gave out the Academy Juvenile Award.
Yes.
Which was given to Haley Mills for her performance in Pollyanna.
Yep.
So good for you, Haley Mills.
It was also the last year that Best Picture would go to a black and white film until Schindler's List.
That's right. Very good. Yeah. That was like 33 years later. So... yeah, so we're entering a interesting territory as we head into the 50s, going backwards. Yeah. So anything else before we deliver our verdict?
No.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to very briefly give another excerpt from Inside Oscar. This was from, what's her name? Melina? Melina Mercouri. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And she mentioned something about having to campaign for herself in terms of the Oscars, which she was not really wanting to do. She had an interesting comment that I just wanted to highlight here that has a very fun kind of kicker at the end. But it says, she said, "At the beginning, I am very happy to have the honor, but what kind of honor is it? First, Luella Parsons writes they shouldn't give it to a foreign actress, but to a nice American girl like Doris Day who makes pictures in Hollywood and not overseas. The UA people say I can't win unless I go back to Hollywood and make a campaign for the Oscar. What kind of campaign should I make? I told them I'm not Kennedy. I'm an actress, not a politician. What do they want me to do? Ring doorbells in Beverly Hills and say, 'Good day, my name is Melina Mercouri, and I would like you to vote for me as the best actress of the year.' We have a saying here in Greece that if you don't vote for yourself, the roof will fall down and the house will catch on fire. Why should I go back there and suffer? Before I was nominated, I was very happy and relaxed. Everybody loved me and the picture. Now I am not happy and I am not relaxed."
Wow.
I just love that now I am not happy and I am not relaxed. Welcome to awards season.
Yeah.
So that's that. That's 1960 in a nutshell. Lots of fun campaigns.
Yeah.
All right. So
that's really interesting that she said that in 1960 when I think isn't it true that 1961 the West Side Story year, isn't that the first year that, because she was talking about, Oscars should go to all-American girls like Doris Day. Isn't 1961 the first year that all 4 acting categories went to non-American actors?
Yes, I believe that's true.
Yeah, for the 2 for West Side Story and Sophia Loren and Maximilian Schell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what a time.
What a time, truly. So when we come back, we'll be delivering our verdict as to whether we think The Apartment deserved that Best Picture win or if Elmer Gantry should have taken it.
I'm honored to present the award for the Best Motion Picture of the Year. The Academy members have nominated The Alamo, Backtrack United Artists, John Wayne Producer. The Apartment, The Mirish Company, United Artists, Billy Wilder Producer. Elmer Gantry, Burt Lancaster, Richard Brooks, United Artists, Bernard Smith Producer. Sons and Lovers, Company of Artists, 20th Century Fox, Jerry Wald Producer. The Sundowners, Warner Brothers, Fred Zinnemann Producer. May I have you? The Apartment, Billy Wilder.
And we're back. So now we'll be delivering our verdict as to whether we think The Apartment deserved Best Picture or if Elmer Gantry should have taken it. Jefferson Grubbs, give me your verdict.
Oh, God, I have to go first?
Yes.
But I'm still undecided.
All right, fine.
Yeah, you go.
Okay. Well, for me, it's clearly The Apartment. Personally speaking, even though I really enjoy Elmer Gantry, I think The Apartment is wonderful. I think it's a great sort of almost like a comforting holiday film in some ways, where it has kind of the screwball comedy, but it also has a lot of the melancholy, and is just there's an effortless quality to it that I just love, that I just go back to. So The Apartment deserved Best Picture. Okay, Jefferson, I bought you enough time.
Good job.
What is your verdict?
I think if I were a member of the Academy in 1960, I would have voted for... God, I'm just going to be different. Say Elmer Gantry.
Ooh, she's different.
I know. They're both great movies. I don't think... That's not me saying I don't think The Apartment didn't deserve to win. It is a worthy winner. I would not take it away from it. But there's something about how Elmer Gantry remains shockingly timely 60 years later that just really spoke to me. I think it's a really interesting film. Yeah, the apartment feels really effortless and comfortable, and there's something about the timeliness of Elmer Gantry that just gives it a slight edge for me. But they're both great. I love them both.
Yeah, and I totally can get behind that. I totally understand that argument. So, yeah, one of these years where I think both of the winner and the runner-up are very much worth your time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jefferson. This was another fantastic episode that helped me bring about the end/beginning of the 1960s.
Yep. Thank you again for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. And you're welcome back anytime.
Yeah.
So,
already.
Tell the people where they can find more of your stuff on the internet.
You can follow me at Mr. Screen Addict. You can follow Thin Gold Line at Awards TGL. We're going to be ramping up our Oscar coverage pretty soon. Yeah.
Excellent. And you can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show is at Oscar Runner Up, and the show is everywhere podcasts can be found. Please rate, review, and subscribe. And I would love a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That always makes my day. And if you want to hear more of this sort of content, where I explore other films that I didn't talk about on the regular show, I talk about other races I didn't talk about on the regular show, you can subscribe to me on Patreon at patreon.com/andtherunnerup for lots of fun bonus episodes. So, once again, thank you, Jefferson.
Thank you.
And I will bid you all adieu.
Adieu. Goodbye.